Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lacey.
Hey.
You can find us online at justonemorefix.com or on Twitter at justonemorefix. If you like us, you can support us at Patreon, and you can give us a rating and review at iTunes or wherever you find us at. In this episode, we're going to talk about Unconventional Dungeons. And now, it's time to get our gaming fix.
Ely from the Starlight Tribune, an Arrow TV show fan podcast, part of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're checking out now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other amazing geeky shows at GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
Welcome to another episode of Just More Fix. Couple quick announcements. First off, Gen Con is coming, and it's right around the corner, coming up at the very first weekend of August, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and we will be there because one is Gen Con and two, we're Indiana natives, so it's just down the road from us. So we are trying to find a time to dedicate to being in one of the open gaming areas to either run some tabletop RPGs or play some board games and just have a general get-together with anybody out there who listens to us and wants to come hang out and put names to a face and play some games. So I think in terms of games, last year we ran Worms, so I might bring that again. And the Hastings party will be done at that point, and maybe some play tests of the Three Sisters if it's ready, but we'll see how that goes. So we're trying to put that date together, and we'll be announcing that here for too long because I know everybody has their events all planned out and whatnot, and we'll just see how it goes. Second announcement is I mentioned Hastings Party, and production is proceeding pretty well, actually. So I got the layout is about 90% of the way done, and I just commissioned the artwork, and I'm going to be getting back the initial concept sketches here pretty soon. So looking forward to getting that going, and hopefully doing a playtest of that this weekend, and I'll be putting up some updates as to how that has gone on the Patreon. Our last announcement is Indie RPG Days continue, and next time we don't have it scheduled quite yet, but I will be bringing Itris B, the surreal sort of storytelling game that is way awesome and was one of the best gaming experiences that I've had at a convention. And we'll be bringing some other kind of a game along with it as well because it is a different kind of a game and probably bringing something a little more conventional maybe to play and see how that goes.
Dungeons and Dragons.
No, come on. All right. So today we are going to talk about Unconventional Dungeons. So everybody is pretty familiar with dungeons because Dungeons and Dragons
contained inside of one.
Right. True story.
Being tortured by the lordship. Down with the patriarchy. Yeah. I don't know where that came from. Half a glass of alcohol. That's where that came from.
So Lacey at our last Indie RPG Day ran Pip Core System and did a mall crawl.
Yep.
With some amount of success.
Yeah. I would say it was pretty successful. I had a good time, and that's my sole marker of success. No. Everybody seemed to enjoy themselves. There was, laughing and joyous noises being made, so I think it was good.
Right on. A big part of the draw for dungeon crawling sometimes is the nostalgia of some old tropes and other adventures from the history of D&D, right? Mm-hmm. And so I thought your mall crawl was a really cool idea because you're sort of touching on those things, but in the real world. So in your scenario, they were going into a mall that had been shut down. Is that right? Or
no, the mall was still functional, but in the way that super popular 1990s malls are functional in this day and age.
So that's open, but there's no one. There's 12 people.
Right.
Okay.
We're on the same page here. And for whatever reason, I just thought it would be more fun if all of the stores inside the mall were iconic 1990s stores.
Fair enough.
So.
Well, and a lot of them still are because there's still a fair amount of JCPenney locations. They didn't go out of business yet, did they?
No.
Okay.
But I like that you had to ask. So this particular mall has a JCPenney. It does also have a Sears. There's a Hot Topic. There is a Limited 2. There's a KB Toys, which is no longer around.
Right.
There is, what else did I put in there? Radio Shack was on my list, but I don't remember if it made it in there or not.
Walden Books or something like that was on there.
Yeah, there's
there's
a Walden Books, because I picked Walden Books because I actually worked at the Walden Books in the mall that where we lived at the time. So yeah.
But either way, there's all these sort of like iconic stores, right?
Yeah. Oh, there's a Chi-Chi's as well. I don't think those are still around either.
I don't know. I'm not sure. Either way.
And Foot Locker.
But
I could go on.
So did you, I saw the map that you made for it, right? Mm-hmm. And it had a very conventional mall look to it, right?
Yes.
But in a way, it sort of has this dungeon-esque feel to it in terms of like laying it out and how it all
it's exactly what it is, right? It's like hallways with like thematic rooms that spur off of the halls.
It's a commercial dungeon, basically.
Yeah. And
the dungeon of capitalism.
Like many fantasy dungeons, the mall is very cookie cutter in a lot of aspects.
Right.
Like, you've seen one, you've seen them all.
Right. There should be a food court nearby. Yeah.
And there is.
Yeah. So I guess just to break down how we're going to go about this today is, you put together this sort of mall crawl adventure and ran it for the Indie RPG Days, right? Mm-hmm. And so I thought it was kind of a neat idea in how we could take the classic tropes of a conventional dungeon and applying them to other genres and the ways that you can sort of twist it to, one, make it fun and appealing, and then sort of grab those cool pieces of pop culture that everybody likes, or like, oh, I remember that, I had one of those, or whatever the heck it is, right? Mm-hmm. And then maybe we can spin this out, depending on how long this goes, into some other genres and ways that you might be able to apply these same kind of concepts. Because I think everyone pretty much that is running games, generally speaking, is pretty comfortable putting together dungeons and dungeon encounters, right? Mm-hmm. But you may not apply that same sort of thought process to other encounters or other setting locations for your games, right? Which is where I thought this kind of was interesting with your mall crawl, because the way you described it, you said quite literally, I'm going to run a mall crawl.
Yeah.
So initially when you put this together, can you walk me through the creative process about like either how it came about or how you intentionally wanted to sort of pull on some of the ideas of the way you put together a dungeon crawl?
I actually came up with kind of the theme of the game first. And so I wanted to do like a neighborhood watch alien mutant creature, very campy, kind of think like Gremlins-esque as opposed to, don't go in expecting hardcore horror. What you're actually getting is like a Gremlins film.
Right.
Okay. So that was kind of my basis for starting.
And I feel like if you're looking for nostalgia stuff, that's probably the better. If you're looking for that nostalgic feel to be like, oh, I found the Garbage Pail Kids or whatever, that's the sort of, you can have horror moments because like the Gremlin movies have some moments of horror, but largely, nostalgic comedy stuff.
So that was kind of the general theme. And the mall idea actually came later because I was trying to think about what could be interesting. And I thought, well, what's a common feature in suburban society, or when you think about not small towns, but, not big city either.
Right.
And it's the mall, right?
Yeah.
But nowadays they're kind of run down, which actually works perfectly for this because, there could be some creature that is lurking inside. And I wanted to select we talked before about creature episodes and how it's always goblins and it's always dragons. So I put a lot of time into thinking about what kind of creatures I don't see very often. Mm-hmm. And it's crustaceans, in case you were wondering.
Okay,
and I was actually thinking of other ways of communication too, because it seems a lot of times like they have their own kind of language, but it always seems to be vocal. Mm-hmm. So I was like, well, what if, it's more, they vocalize some noise, but I thought about how...
Did you have like the crab with the big hand that's like...
No, not quite.
Oh man! For those that can't see me, which is everyone except for Lacey, the crab with the one big claw, and they always raise them up to be like, "What's up? What's up? Back up! I'm gonna pinch you."
So I kind of looked into ants.
Okay.
And how colonies communicate and things like that. And it didn't end up playing as much of a role when we actually got into the game because, it's a one shot, it goes quickly or whatever,
right.
But it just kind of helped me visualize how the creature was going to be. And then I thought, well, what if instead of a dragon, we had like an evolution of this singular species? And so you have smaller creatures and then you get progressively bigger and more intelligent. And then you have one queen, right? Like you see in the Alien movie.
Right.
And you know, that's reflective in real life with bees and ants again. Right. So I was like, oh, well, that's like, and it's in this centralized area. Like that's basically the dragon in your dungeon, right?
Right.
And so then my next thought was naturally that it should have a hoard. But what would be better than a hoard of money? Unless you're someone who is actually after treasure, a hoard of something random and hilarious, which led me to the idea of the 1990s random table of hoard generation. Right. I don't even know what you want to call it.
Well, the fun part about that could be, though, is in terms of treasure, they could find random things that don't really seem to have value, but there's collectors for everything, right? So then maybe the next thing is trying to
set up an eBay store and now they're millionaires, right? And so then I kind of thought that I would further develop the mall idea and basically combine it with the hex crawl. Mm-hmm. In that it's not necessarily, you know, move 5 feet, go here, move 5 feet, go here. But like you're in this zone, and in this zone, there are these potential encounters that can happen. And with the mall idea, it's really easy because the stores are very thematic.
Right.
So then you can have, you know, these campy kind of funny encounters that happen in these stores. So like, you know, you go to Limited 2 and you're like being attacked with a piercing gun or, you know.
Oh, God. Does that happen?
No, that did not happen, but it definitely could have. I didn't really develop the idea as fully as I would have liked to, honestly, as far as the hex crawl thing goes, but it's still kind of looming in the distance. So I made development more just because it's a fun
Yeah, well, it was kind of like a proof of concept, too, to see if it would actually come together and work. So, and very clearly it did, you know, so...
But we did spend a lot of time in the food court, and that was kind of fun. And I incorporated my alien creatures who had an intense love of soda because it was supposed to be that they were mutated by surge.
Oh, right on.
That had been left over in the basement of this mall. And so they come around into the food court to find 2 of these alien creatures assisting the third and doing a keg stand on the fountain soda pop machine.
Right on. All right, so I guess initially what I'm kind of getting from this is that you had an initial idea, right? Mm-hmm. And that's sort of how a lot of adventures and dungeons are put together. And then you sort of, at least for us, we sort of like build some adversaries and then build a mythology around them. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And that's really kind of what I'm seeing is that you have like, you know, the ants and the queen and all this kind of stuff, you know, and you can kind of draw on some alien tropes from, you know, from that kind of movie stuff. And then, you know, build like, why are they so different and all this kind of stuff, and why does it matter? And so then building out this larger mythology about the surge, which is an awesome, terrible reference to a 90s soda. And also in a kind of a fun way, reminiscent of the Ninja Turtles ooze as well. So it's kind of a fun kind
mutated creatures.
Dual entendre there, or double entendre. But so... You've kind of built this little bit of mythology around these creatures that are running around the mall or whatever. So then where did it go from there? Once you had like the initial sort of like mall layout and like this sort of little bit of mythology for the creatures, what was the next step like to actually make it? I guess what was the process to make it from where it's just I go into a mall and there's bugs and now we have to kill them? Do you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Like what was the... Because all these dungeons and adventures start with some kind of obstacle initially that sets things in motion, and then you eventually find out what the real problem is inside the dungeon, right? Like, what is the big
the general theme, if you remember, is that it's a neighborhood watch. So I made a group of pre-gen PCs that were all part of this neighborhood watch, and keeping with the campy theme, they were not what you would call
useful.
super adept folks. I mean, so we had a exterminator. We had a retired celebrity chef. We had a weekend warrior, which is like a member of the National Guard, right? So soldier on the weekends, right? And then we had a stay-at-home dad and a homeschooled child. And that was our neighborhood watch.
Right on.
And then I gave them each a piece of information that they knew that they could choose to share or not. So the celebrity chef had a friend who had seen lights on the north end of town during the night, strange, like glowing lights, and had said that he was pretty sure it was aliens. But I also included the tidbit that everybody knows that he's a paranoid conspiracy theorist and may or may not be believed. But you have also seen the lights, so that much at least is true.
Right. There's at least some credibility there.
The homeschooled kid had actually found one of these creatures and was secretly keeping it as a pet.
That seems like an amazing idea.
The stay-at-home dad did not have a secret because they didn't join the game until about an hour later, so I didn't give them an initial thing. The exterminator had received a number of unusual pest control calls all within the location, all around the area of the mall.
Right.
And then the weekend warrior had been finding unusual animal tracks that they had been investigating.
Okay.
And so then I started them off at a neighborhood watch meeting and just kind of left it open to them
as to
what they would discuss, if they would discuss it. And of course they did, because it's a one shot and that's the information they currently have.
So that's what you go do, right? Exactly. We embrace the awesome of the one shot. So you've kind of addressed one of the things. So we have like kind of a brief list of sort of like classic dungeon things in a fantasy world, right? And one of them you've kind of mentioned already is, which is easy in this sense, because like one of the big things that's always weird to me is, why is this dungeon here? Right? There are so many dungeons that you encounter in fantasy games. You're like, why is this even? What is happening? Why are there? Like, what? Why? Who? You know, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I don't nitpick at it because it's part of the fun of going through the dungeon crawl and finding the things and killing the bad guys.
Wouldn't it be funny though, like if in the fantasy sense dungeons were like a leftover remnant of something that used to be useful, just like the mall was?
Right. But it wouldn't make sense. Like, there's a mall.
This used to be an underground school.
Right. It's like, why did they just order their stuff online? Well, that wasn't a thing. So they went to the mall. No, right, but they couldn't.
But what if they didn't have what you wanted?
Why didn't they just like order it from Amazon? No, there was no Amazon. What?
This is like explaining pre-internet to the children.
Yes, exactly.
Well, why don't you just look on Google?
There was no Google.
Well.
Yeah. So it's a fun way to sort of have a location there that makes sense. And I feel like in sort of an improvisational way, when someone asks questions that you don't know, when you already have something with a physical, real reference that you can draw from, and everyone has these sort of classic notions of what's in a mall, it makes those improvisation moments a lot easier. And the players will give you a lot of leeway, especially if you're sort of invoking those classic notions of what you find in a mall. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I guess that's the first thing that's always sort of troubled me about a lot of dungeons is, why is this physically here? But in this sense, it's already explained away. It's a mall.
Right.
Whether it's you're running it in the 80s, in the 90s, or in contemporary times, or even if it's just a shut down mall, you know, like, and those have existed
because it used to be popular.
Exactly.
And we haven't torn it down yet.
And now it's all closed down and boarded up, right? Which presents a whole lot of new possibilities in terms of like a dungeon crawl way, in an unconventional way, that you could have this old dilapidated building that's falling apart and leaking everywhere, and that draws in all the classic moments of dungeon crawls with like water and underground moldiness and you know, everything being wet, all that kind of terribleness that exists, you know.
You also have that classic kind of haunted house feel too,
yeah.
Like with anything that is abandoned and unkempt and derelict.
All right, so you already talked about sort of like minions and a boss monster that was in there. So did they fight the boss monster in the mall? Or
yes, they did. The boss monster was actually in the basement of the mall.
Of course.
Yeah. So they were not aware of it, and actually they had no idea there was going to be like a queen boss monster.
How did they not see that coming?
I don't know. I mean, maybe they knew about it and they were just, you know,
right, playing along.
Well,
fair enough.
You can say, like, you don't see that coming, but then at the same time, when someone describes something the size of Godzilla that looks like a lobster, you're like, wait a second. I did not see that coming.
Fair enough. So we've already got sort of minions and this boss monster. So if you hadn't done ants, can you think of other things that you might use?
Well, I didn't really do like ants.
Well, but okay, crustaceans, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. So can you think of any other creatures or something that you could use in a modern sense that wouldn't be like orcs and goblins?
Oh, centipedes would be super gross.
Oh, yeah, that would be terrible.
Just throwing that out there.
Like just vermin in general, bugs.
Camel crickets.
Nah.
Man-sized camel crickets that
Jump
can hop
attacks.
60 feet at a time.
He's in the food court. It'll be okay. We're like 4 hallways down.
Oh, God. What is this attack? He doesn't do anything else. He just hops and he looks gross.
He landed on Scott. Right.
Sorry. Bugs are always a good one, right? Because people are naturally kind of grossed out by them. They communicate in a way that's like really alien to us. Everything about them is completely different, you know, from the skeleton to how their eyes functions to how they communicate. Like, it's all just vastly different, which is cool.
I think go with like serpents
are cool.
Yeah, like big gelatinous
things that are pseudopod in nature.
Big gels and oozes or whatever, you know. I think snakes could be fun too, because if you want to do in a modern game with like a lot of conspiracy stuff, there's always like these lizard people or whatever, so you could kind of draw on some like shapeshifters that are controlling the food court or whatever and trying to poison or hypnotize people or something in the movie theater. A lot of things you can do that way, maybe. So yeah, I just think it's interesting to sort of,
you know, any of the not top 25 creatures contained in monster manuals. Like we talked about this before, like there's loads of good creatures. Like, you just don't see them, you don't encounter them, and people aren't using them.
Right.
So,
or you can do gray aliens and, you know, mind control stuff if you want to do it in a modern way too. So there's in the basement of it, there's like this chief lieutenant gray alien that's, you know, got his minions that are going out and doing things. But maybe you're encountering mind-controlled regular people initially. And then as you go into the basement, then you encounter some regular gray aliens and then the supreme gray or whatever. So there's lots of options there that you can do to sort of shift the paradigm, but really still continue to draw on the same tropes and experience that you have from running fantasy games, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so generally speaking, when we put dungeons together, they're kind of modular, which is one of the features about this mall. And it's kind of interesting because everybody has this general feel, you know, sort of like, well, in D&D, when you're a dwarf and you're underground, there's usually some mechanism for you to make like a sense direction roll or something to be able to know, oh, we're going downhill. Even though it's like, I feel like that sort of same sense applies in a mall. If you've ever, you know, been in them for so like, oh yeah, I can see the anchor stores to our right, which means this hallway leads to the food court. And
if you've ever been in a large one that has like 6 or 7 branches, you're like, wait, which way was the center again?
Right, yeah. Well, everything is based on the anchor stores, which is always kind of funny, I think. But all I'm getting at is that they're sort of modular, and that there's this general sense of how the mall flows in a way, right? With little kiosks and that kind of stuff. And
the more we talk about this, the more I really feel like I need to do a dungeon crawl, mall crawl fusion, where like it's set in a fantasy world, but it's like an underground mall. So there's like leftover like signposts for like, you know, like the Dwarven Emporium and like
right.
The Goblin Market. Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. I'm just
the
sort
idea
of
is just amusing me.
I'm just looking over our list of things here.
It kind of reminds me of that what is the Maze Rats board game or whatever, where you're kind of like in a mall, but you're like dwarves. It's like running around. Anyway.
So you mentioned treasure and sort of like this hoard of things that they were gathering at the bottom in their secret lair or whatever, which brings in a lot of sort of awesome nostalgia moments and cool things that can be generated off random tables.
Well, it seems like in the non-fantasy setting, we're a lot less concerned with gold accumulation and treasure accumulation.
Right.
So the dragon's hoard is very stereotypical, and I like the idea of it. But then I was
pile
like,
of coins with
you know,
a sword
why does it have to be gold? Like I've seen, you know, people who have done artistic renderings of the dragon with like hordes of stuffed animals or hordes of this or that, and I was like, well, what if it was the same thing, like hordes of something totally useless that this creature has decided is the thing that it must have,
right?
And clearly it's some sort of iconic 1990s item. So
well, it's just been hoarding. It's like stealing this stuff slowly over the course of a decade.
Right. And you're like, literally no one wants a million Beanie Babies except for this creature right here that is sitting on top of all of them.
There's a terrible shrinkage problem at the one of the stores. So did you have any of the classic pieces of the that you would normally find in a dungeon, like traps or secret doors, like doors that were blocked or stuck that you had to sort of find your way through?
So we did have some like locked door moments when they were trying, because there is regardless of whether or not the mall is open and functioning, I envisioned there being like the solo mall security guard who is on duty. So if they made like way too much noise, then there was a potential that the mall guard would come and investigate. So there's just like this panic moment where someone is coming and they need to try and get out of the hallway, and the only place that they can get to, because like the gate is down, you know, the big metal gate, everyone's familiar, that you close the shop with, and there's like no crawling around that. And so somebody's trying to like lockpick the door to the maintenance closet open. Okay. So that they can, all 5 of them plus a crustacean who's about 3 feet tall, squeeze into this singular maintenance closet to hide from the mall security guard, right? So there's that locked door scenario. And then instead of secret doors, because there aren't a lot of those in real life, right? No. But we're all familiar with, like picture the original Die Hard movie, and you get John McClane crawling around the ventilation shafts, right? Yeah, the ductwork. So there is a scene when they're looking and like these creatures have all disappeared, and somebody's like, well, like, is there a ventilation shaft in here? I'm like, well, of course there is,
well, that sort of totally fits the secret door trope, though.
And it's not really secret. I mean, like, everybody knows it's there.
Right, but you don't think of it as a door, and that's exactly what that's supposed to do. Like, it's like a secret passage that leads between 2 rooms, right? So even if it's you just need a screwdriver to pull the vent off, it still totally sort of converts that secret door as a trope into the modern times.
And it presented an interesting scenario, too, because I tried to kind of stick with real life, and that this opening is only so big. Right. So, the fit person who is part of the National Guard could probably fit in there. Yes. The 10-year-old child, definitely fitting in there. Stay-at-home dad, there is not like, he described his character as being like fluffy, basically. Like, there's no way you're getting in there, my friend. So your child just disappeared into this ventilation shaft.
What are you going to do?
What are you going to do?
Right on. Did you have random encounters for this entire thing, or how did you work that?
So for some of it, I did. And like when they went into the movie theater, I kind of had decided that it would be, maybe it wasn't random, but I was going to come up with a random encounter, like 2 or 3 potential things that would happen in each store. Right. But, human laziness or whatever. But I had kind of thought about the movie theater going in, and so these creatures are a lot shorter than regular people. So there is a movie that starts playing while they're in there, but if you go into the theater and you don't walk all the way in, you won't see them because they're sitting in the seats, but their heads are below the seats. So then they go and like investigate the room where the movie plays, right? And so they see like one of these creatures, and this is the moment they realize that they're not just, because before you're kind of thinking, oh, well, it's just like an animal. When you walk up and you realize this creature is the one that's running the projector, and you're like, whoa, that's a whole different level of sentience. That is a little bit terrifying.
Right on.
So that was kind of fun. And then but yeah, I had planned some other interesting encounters, like there was a Sam Goody, so I had kind of pictured the potential for if the creatures. I thought it'd be cool in some dungeons and other like encounters and scenarios I've seen where people roll randomly to see where the creatures will be. So I thought that seemed like a reasonable thing, because a mall is a pretty big place, right? So kind of roll ahead of time to see where the creatures will be and then determine what kind of interactions they could have if the creatures were there. But so there's a Sam Goody, which for those of you who aren't aware was a major CD selling place for like music and stuff. There would be a creature that was there, and when they entered would be like trying to attack them with CDs like Ninja Star style.
Right on.
So I thought that would be fun. And then, the Foot Locker, there's like sporting, sneakers and sporting goods. So you could have some kind of like sports related basketball sort of encounter there. Because like the logo is like the guy dressed like a referee and all that. So
right on. So I just see lots of moments of sort of fun nostalgia, but that also sort of fit a larger context. It's not just a greatest hits moment of all the cool stores and things that you bought in the 90s or saw at a mall. It has bits of that, but still fits into a larger context of an actual story.
And I tried to think about in each scenario, like, okay, let's say that I lived inside of JCPenney and somebody was coming to attack my home.
Right.
What would be the most likely way for me to defend myself using the items that are contained within a typical JCPenney?
You need to go to Sears. That's where you need to be.
Well, Sears is the obvious one. That's where all the power tools are.
Yes. Yes. I guess the last one we haven't mentioned, because I have Lair and Monster Lair sort of here, and you've mentioned how there are moments where these creatures are living in the mall, and so what do they use at JCPenney's to defend themselves, and working the projector and watching the films and that kind of stuff. So it sort of brings the setting to light in a different way, because these creatures are sort of in their own alien way making use of the human world in their own kind of way, right? Mm-hmm. So were there any traps that you had set up, or that you had the creatures make, or anything like that? Because traps is a big trope for dungeons, obviously. So was there anything like that? Because you sort of have these like crustacean creatures. I can see them kind of building weird traps, maybe. Was that a thing or no?
Not really. Honestly, not really a thing. It definitely could have been. And that would be a cool thing to incorporate, but just like time being of the essence, I didn't.
Right on.
Didn't incorporate that.
The last one I have is Fallen Heroes. So usually when you're in a dungeon, there's the people that came there before you unsuccessfully. So were there any signs of people that had tried to deal with these crustacean creatures in the past, or were these are the heroes in this situation sort of like the first ones to go attempt this?
No, they were sort of the first ones to go attempt it. And that was kind of part of the story backdrop, too, in that them being the neighborhood watch. It's like they were the only ones paying attention. And up until now, these creatures were able to maintain under the radar in this, like, nondescript, non-busy mall that people have just sort of forgotten about. And they had seized that opportunity to make themselves a home there and go unrecognized up until that point.
Right on.
So they really are the heroes of the story.
Fair enough. So I think that's some of the major tropes we talked about, like minions and like a boss monster or a dragon. We talked about it being modular, sort of like the challenges of the environment, like locked doors and secret doors and traps, a large amount of treasure, random encounters. Why is this place here? I guess before we move on to like other genres, was there? You said it was successful, but did that surprise you?
I don't think it really surprised me, because I think once you tell people that it's not meant to be super serious, that they're really on board for being a little bit silly with you.
Right. And
it was obvious in the collection of pre-gen NPCs, the kind of theme that we were going for. So I think because the theme was well established, that people knew it was just going to be kind of like lighthearted and a little less serious, and they were ready to have that kind of a good time.
Right.
I was a little bit worried about the 1990s thing, like if people showed up that were significantly younger than me, that like maybe they wouldn't get some of what it was.
I think so. I understand that, but I feel like the 90s is close enough that if you have an older sibling, or an older cousin, that you probably have some. Now, if you go 80s,
that's kind of what I was hoping for. Yeah, because 80s you get a little
You're starting to lose some of that connection. Although with games or shows like Ready Player One and that kind of stuff, there is some of that, bringing that back, but not a lot of the minutia of things.
Well, and there's a lot of like 1980s nostalgia out there now, because which I get, because a lot of gamers are of that age, but I'm a little bit younger than that, and I haven't seen any good nods to the 90s, which is kind of another reason why I wanted to do this.
Right on.
Because my generation matters too. We're not just the generation between the 80s and the 2000s.
Well, All right, so I don't want to focus too much on building encounters for this, because they kind of like put themselves together once you've, in order to make them thematic for the store, that they would like, when you are looking at.
And I think that's kind of something you can take away from this too, is that if you put a good amount of thought into theme and monster and location, that encounters should flow naturally from that initial selection.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if you think about movies that sort of do these kind of things where maybe it's not a creature feature, sort of like in that sense, but like everybody knows movies that take place sort of like in a store or in a mall, where they have those moments where they're sort of making their way from one scene to another. And when they're in the sporting goods store, there's always giant basketballs or soccer balls or baseball bats or tennis rackets that are being used, and maybe batting helmets and whatever. And then when they're in the sporting goods store, they're, or not the sporting goods, when they're in the, I don't know, the tool store or whatever, there's saws and what, like it's sort of writes itself in a way. Mm-hmm. And I really feel like you mentioned before, setting the tone and theme with the players beforehand, they've already embraced sort of like the sort of lightheartedness or the silliness of it a little bit. So they're going to know, I'm in this section of Sears, this is what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to hide in the refrigerator or whatever.
And it's expected in that type of game that you're going to pick the most stereotypical, over-the-top type thing for that setting and run with it, because that's what works best in this particular theme. Well,
I feel like in this situation, we're talking about like this sort of 90s mall crawl thing. What you say is definitely correct, but I also feel like it's correct in the sense of a fantasy game, because what do? You sort of default to your classic fantasy tropes and things that you do to avoid and get out of and solve problems, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know that there's much of a difference. While one is more lighthearted than the other, functionally, I feel like it's the same thing. Do you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's take this outside of the scope of the mall crawl thing, right? And kind of address some of the other genres, okay?
Okay.
So we mentioned Alien as in reference to sort of these crustacean creatures. So I think we'll start there. And when I say Alien, obviously there's an Alien RPG on Kickstarter right now, but one that comes to mind for me that I really like is Mothership. And I've ran a fair amount of Mothership now, and I realized when I was putting it together that when you build a space station or a spaceship, the way they have you do it with their random generator, it's like these modules that are put together. So like this is an engineering module, and this is a fuel module, and this is a power module, and whatever. It really sort of follows the same train of thought. And it's kind of neat because space stations are all set up with these little sort of pieces that are kind of cobbled together. Mm-hmm. And there doesn't necessarily have to be a method to the madness, because maybe life support went down on the other side of the ship and we just had to put this one here. I don't know. And then we never moved it because it still worked. So who cares? But I feel like some of the same philosophy can definitely apply in the way you're talking about putting together dungeons, or this mall crawl can definitely apply in that sort of space station or space Hulk kind of adventure, whether that's Mothership or 40K or any kind of science fiction action adventure horror kind of a thing.
Absolutely. And I kind of like the fusion you see in sci-fi a lot of times, where you combine that with like an investigative element that you don't see necessarily in a lot of fantasy dungeon crawls.
True.
And so a really good example of this is I ran Doctor Who Dread RPG for you and the kids with the Jenga Tower like we'd done before, but it was based basically solely off of a Stephen Baxter Doctor Who novel, wherein there was a mining colony on what was left of this like space station, I guess you would call it, and it actually led down into an asteroid that they were mining. So that's the perfect setup for a dungeon crawl. Like the asteroid is the dungeon, and then you have the spaceship that's also attached to that. So it's kind of an easy thing to pull off in that sort of sci-fi scenario.
I think following along with the science fiction, there's a lot of sort of like cyberpunk and big hive city, sort of like mega city stuff going on there.
Yeah, I think of the Hive City scenario we ran with Warhammer 40K, where we were, I think we were all Space Marines, I don't recall, but there was chaos inside the Hive and
badness, and
it was, basically the terrible apartment complex.
But I think you can apply the same sort of logic in that it's sort of like this modular, tenement buildings with restaurants and sort of, shops and stores at the bottom, but all sort of stacked on top of one another in that sort of classic dungeon style where there's not a lot of space, because that's part of the conceit with these cyberpunk and science fiction cities is that like it's overpopulated and dirty and dense. And that is very, very dungeon-y to me, right? Instead of having like these cobblestone walls, now it's just like sort of prefab habitats and sheet metal that's sort of like riveted and welded together, right?
Mm-hmm. So my brain was kind of stuck in this pip system, a little bit sillier, not serious setting. So the examples that I came up with were like a Honey, I Shrunk the Kids kind of scenario where you're entering into some kind of large insect hive. So I was thinking about like when they're riding the ant and there's this ant hill and all of this. So I thought that could potentially be interesting. And then like infestation, you're inside this giant, just dirty, nasty house. So there's the potential for some kind of weird garbage dungeon that could be gross and interesting.
Dungeon. That could be terrible. Junkyard could be a cool, like a junkyard / dump landfill kind of a thing.
And as I said that, I kind of thought of the labyrinth when she's in, and there's like little puppet with the carrying the thing on its back, and she's like lost in the mountain of garbage, stuck in this dreamland kind of thing.
There's a moment where she's like, it's like a landsliding down on her and everything else. Yeah, there's some really cool moments that I think you could have there. So haunted house is another one we have on our list, and
I think we've talked about this before too.
Yes,
with the haunted houses being very equivalent to the dungeon crawl.
And the only thing I will mention is Hell House Beckons by Kyle Chenier is an amazing way to sort of look at this. And I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but there are three or four different possibilities for what happens in the haunted house, depending on the sort of path the adventurers choose in that specific adventure. And I think you could apply the same sort of logic that exists in that to any other haunted house adventure you would want to run. And it's sort of applies that sort of classic OSR DIY D&D methodology to a haunted house, but also gives it its own very definite twist where you still have the haunted house feel to it. And
the Cursed Chateau is another excellent example of this, and it incorporates kind of a maze and a mansion and a subterranean area
and the grounds and all that. Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
We were talking about Unconventional Dungeons, and one of the other things that popped into my head was kind of that Jonah and the whale story. And there is a one-page dungeon that exists for that particular scenario where the dungeon crawl is inside the belly of a large creature.
Right.
And it's called...
I can't remember what the name of the one-page dungeon thing is, but there is an actual complete game called Belly of the Beast that also uses the same sort of ideas. It just goes much deeper into the the methodology of trying to survive while living inside some kind of a leviathan. So like the organ that you're in and what that environment might look like if you're in a spleen versus like the liver or a gallbladder and all this kind of stuff, right? And how does it all work? And it has its own system for it. I can't remember what the system actually is, but just by itself, I think it's worth it if you want to sort of have this kind of cool moment where your players might get eaten by like a giant sea dragon turtle or something like that. I think there's some really cool moments that might be had in there where they're sort of like you're at a transition, you don't know what to do. They're going somewhere by sea and the ship just gets swallowed by a giant leviathan. Like, not live or die. The whole thing is just gulp. It's gone.
Well, and I know for sure that Isaiah had ran a one shot that was a giant sea turtle creature, and the dungeon was all contained within that creature.
Right.
So it's another really, really cool idea. And then kind of the last thing I wanted to mention is it's more stereotypical than some of the other ones that we've talked about, but also unconventional compared to your very typical dungeon crawl that you're always running, and that's the labyrinth. And it's something that I would like to see more of. First of all, because like minotaurs are pretty cool, like the half human, half beast creatures are just really, you don't, I feel like, see enough of them. And the idea of the maze and kind of the confusion that goes along with that,
right?
And the idea of being like stalked or hunted. Is always an interesting element to add into things.
Well, I definitely feel if you want to go with the labyrinth, that's probably the key right there, is that being stalked, I think, is a great word for it, and hunted.
We have to add that in with the element of being lost, too.
So there's always this urgency to get out, but you can't, but there's always something pursuing you. So how do you find your way when you're lost and being pursued? Do you have anything else to add about this, or...
I don't think so. I think I've just spent a lot of time talking about how awesome I feel like my game is. But
right on.
It was a really cool idea.
Well, it was, and it sounds like it was a lot of fun. And I think it's just an interesting way, because that's ultimately that's the goal for any of this, is to have fun at the table. And I think sometimes you feel like when you're running one game in any genre, right, that you learn to run that game, you get proficient at it, you know the mechanics, you know the themes, you know the tones, all that kind of stuff, the tropes. And then you go to a different style. So maybe you're going from fantasy to horror or from fantasy to investigative. And sometimes there's a tendency to feel like I don't know how to do this at all. But really, what you just need to do is find the way to connect to the new tropes and new themes that are in the new game you're running. But at the same time, draw on the experience and your strong points from the stories that you've already told. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to do here, is to blend some of the classic moments and things that we're all good at and have learned from running loads and loads of D&D and loads of dungeon encounters and that kind of stuff, and bringing that into other settings, and how can that inform the encounters and things that we're putting together. Because I think that you can kind of blend the two together nicely, because...
And I think you end up with something better than you started with if you do that.
That's exactly where I was going, is it's sort of like the blending of the two, because you've already got the strong suits and all the things you've learned from making dungeons, and now you can apply those same lessons that you've already learned to other areas. Right on. Well, as you guys know, we are a member of the Gunna Geek Network. So a quick promo for On the Bubble podcast, Witchblade First Wave of the Dresden Files, and plus the role of physical items in fan campaigning episode 35. So fans of the Dresden Files sent drumsticks, First Wave fans sent salt packets, and Witchblade fans sent Pez dispensers. But did any of these actually move the renewal needle? So check that out. That is On the Bubble podcast, episode 35, and you can find them on the Gunna Geek Network. I think that'll do it for us this week. So if you guys have made any awesome unconventional dungeons, or sort of brought that sort of ethos of dungeoneering into any of your other scenarios and encounters, let us know on Facebook, or give us a shout out on Twitter, or you can email me, James at JustOneMoreFix, and we'd love to sort of hear about it and see the ways that you have incorporated unconventional dungeons into your games. If you like what we do here at Just One More Fix, you can support us at patreon.com/JustOneMoreFix and get access to all of our raw audio feeds and pre-shows, as well as early access to our actual play for Night Witches, which still continues, even though we've had sort of a brief break from it because of other projects. But it'll be coming back this Friday. And you can also get access to all of our PDF copies of our quarterly zine, as well as print copies of our zine as well. And join the awesome ranks of our Patreon supporters like Treza, Tiziano Furlano, Simon McNair, Alan White, and the OG Todd Olson. So I think that'll do it for us, and we will see you guys next week.
Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetech.com. You can support us at patreon.com/JustOneMoreFix, or follow us on Twitter at JustOneMoreFix.